Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Australian business leaders are increasingly optimistic about the economic outlook, with a growing number planning to increase headcount over the next 12 months. Nearly 9 in 10 CEOs also see AI as important to their company's strategy, and globally, business leaders reporting an increase in revenue and workplace efficiency because of the technology. There are some of the key findings from PwC's 28th Annual Global CEO Survey, which interviewed more than 4,700 CEOs across 100 countries and territories. Amy Lomas is Chief Economist at PwC Australia. Amy, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, Sean. I'm very pleased to be here.
So looking at it, it kind of looks to me we're an optimistic bunch, but perhaps not an adventurous bunch, at least the CEOs of Australia.
Wow, that's a good place to start. So there are a few results in the survey that were a surprise to us, and I think you could draw the conclusion that perhaps there is a level of, we use the term complacency, but you could say that we're not an adventurous bunch. There was one area where it was a contradiction to that, but actually there are two areas where that sense of adventure might not be there. The first is in relation to AI. So probably the first thing to say about AI is it's only really been with us, and it's only really been on the radar of CEOs for the last couple of years. So in the survey, we did ask all the CEOs, so that's 4,700 CEOs across the globe, around where they're at with AI. We asked them to what extent they're observing efficiency improvements, to what extent AI is part of their business strategy going forward, and to what extent they're starting to see benefits in terms of improvements to profit and improvements to revenue. What came through was that while Australian CEOs and global CEOs all unanimously, and I think that in the majority of cases, see AI as an important part of their business strategies going forward, when it comes to current realisation of benefits, Australian CEOs are behind global CEOs. So I think we had about 30% of global CEOs reporting realised benefits in terms of profit and revenue, compared to something kind of half of that for Australian CEOs. And the other area that stood out beyond AI was around what we would call climate-friendly investments. So similarly, there is a distinct difference between reportable, tangible business benefits from Australian CEOs in relation to their climate-friendly investments compared to global CEOs.
On the AI thing, what I found interesting, I think there was 116 Australian CEOs in the overall survey, so there's good sample size. They seem a little less complacent, or maybe I see more wary around security and the benefits of AI. It's almost like there's still teething problems with AI for local CEOs.
Yes, so that actually came through globally as well as locally, but particularly strong locally is that there is still a nervousness around trusting AI, and I think it's largely around. It ties in with the debate around the use of personal data, the use of commercial data, and that we don't yet fully understand how these systems work, the layperson. And, we're all upskilling in how AI works. And so no one wants to be in a situation where information that's been provided to you in the course of your business or that you generate within your business ends up somewhere in an algorithm. Or caught up in, a large language model that you didn't want to find its way there. So I think that lack of trust is probably more a reflection of our emerging understanding of how these systems work and what specific controls you need to put in place to ensure that you can adopt and embed AI in a way where you're really confident that it's doing the things that you want it to do and not doing the things that you don't want it to do. But there is just one other point that I think is really relevant from an AI perspective, is that Australian CEOs reported they feel less exposed to technological disruption than global CEOs do. And so I think that imperative, that sense of challenge to your existing business model, into your existing business practices that come from technological change and is not being felt as keenly by Australian CEOs. And so there probably isn't the impetus to really embed it and generate the benefits. You need the benefits, the commercial benefits, to succeed in the world ahead. That's clearly being felt more keenly by our global CEOs than our local CEOs.
Okay, stay with me, Amy. We'll be back in a moment. I'm speaking with Amy Lomas, PwC Australia's Chief Economist. You are an economist, and actually by background, I'm an economist as well. I've got to ask, 47% of CEOs are optimistic about the global economic outlook. Why do you think they are? I mean, I think that's a pretty upbeat outlook, really.
I have to differ with you on that point, but we'll come to that in a minute. So the optimism, there is absolutely an optimism in the survey. There's an optimism around global GDP growth. And then locally, there's more optimism than what we've seen in previous surveys around Australian GDP growth. I think in terms of the specific survey, and we've been undertaking this survey for the last 28 years, so it's fabulous in terms of giving us a time series. But if you look back over the last few years, the real low point in terms of optimism around growth was around 2022, 2023. And we've seen each survey since that time has shown an improvement, both globally and locally. And it's pretty clear what the reasons why are, in my view. It's not so much that when you look ahead that we've got great forecasts globally and in Australia for GDP. It's more that the tail end of COVID is finally starting to really come off. And in particular, when you look at the threats that CEOs are monitoring, so that was one of the questions that we asked in the survey, the number one threat is inflation. And we've had global inflation. Unfortunately, Australia's a little bit behind the rest of the developing world in terms of getting inflation back between the Reserve Bank's targets. But the unwinding of that inflationary pressure and I guess a return to what I would call more normal economic conditions without a supply side shock like we had with COVID, puts everyone more on a kind of an even keel in terms of understanding the economic dynamics that they're contending with. Because when you actually look at the forecasts for global GDP, particularly for developing countries, it's still sitting at around 1.8% thereabouts compared to sort of 4.2% for emerging and developing countries. So, you know, we're half the growth rates that you might see in some of those developing countries across the board, with the exception of the US, which is obviously the standout from an economic growth perspective at the moment. So I think that's the explanation, or at least that's the one that I've come up with.
I like it, Amy. I like it. What about the labour market? So about 41% of CEOs are planning to increase headcount in 2025. I suppose the question is, how does that compare to previous years? And the labour market's an interesting one in Australia because it is so strong. I mean, it just keeps giving. Do CEOs think that's going to continue?
Yeah, so in a similar way that we've seen optimism around growth, we've also seen from survey to survey a marked uptick globally and in Australia around, I guess it's a form of optimism from CEOs around increasing headcount. So it's really noticeable in the Australian results this year. So I think you quoted the stat, 41%. That's about double what was quoted last year. So I think that, again, fits into that sort of broader improvement in the sort of baseline macroeconomic conditions, the inflation coming off, etc., and less resources being spent within an organisation, I guess, fighting off some of the threats and starting to think more, focusing more on future growth opportunities, and CEOs knowing that they need human resources to achieve those growth opportunities. But to your point, Australia in particular has a very tight labour market, a very high participation rate. As an economist, I could never have imagined that we would be in this situation. I remember when I was studying economics, long-term unemployment was, like a really protracted issue.
Mm.
We're in a completely different situation now. And so I guess there's a question around hiring intentions from the perspective of the type of people that we need, because one of the threats that comes through in the survey is access to the right skilled workers. So hiring intentions, I think, goes to hiring the right type of people for the future growth that you need, which might be different from the composition of the workforce you have in place now. And then there's that second question around, is there the labour market that you need to draw from to meet those hiring intentions? Which brings me to a really important point, which is also critical for Australia right now, is that labour productivity is at an all-time low. Our average labour productivity that we've experienced over the last 10 years is last 20 years is half that of the 20 years prior. And this is why we're so interested in AI, because it's things like AI that can really help to drive labour force productivity and strike that balance between those hiring intentions, the type of skills that you need, but also how can you get more from the workforce that you have.
Amy, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you.
That was Amy Lomas, Chief Economist at PwC Australia. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.